My name is Amy Glasmeier, and I am a professor in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I am a regional planner and economic geographer, and I work on topics related to industrialization, urbanization, inequality, and geographic dispersal. What do economic geographers do? There's a lot of different kinds of geographers, as I'm sure you probably guess. An economic geographer is a person who is interested in explaining the spatial distribution of people, places, and things and their interactions over the globe. Some people work looking at the moon and the stars. Some people look at the bottom of the ocean. We use spatial and economic concepts to explain the reality we experience on a daily basis. Economic geography is one of the most, I would say, easy to understand aspects of the discipline of geography. Why is that? Because we have these mechanisms, such as markets, as an example, and we have things like distance, as an example. And these allow us to create measurements. And then when we can create measurements, we are able to put these elements into relation. And from there, we can actually begin to talk about their relative values. So economic geography uses distance, proximity, remoteness to describe spatial relationships among people, places, and things. We also use it to explain ideas and institutions. And we draw from a field of geographic thought, including localization, location, urbanization, and scale. I'm going to talk today about remote. And I'm going to say a little bit about COVID, but I'm really going to talk about the meaning of remote, which is a term that's elusive, but it doesn't seem like it because we traditionally have these rather steadfast definitions of what remote means. But if we get down into the details, what we find out is that remote is elusive. And the reason it is elusive is because it has both an absolute quality to it and it has a relative quality to it. And when you're dealing with relative circumstances, you have to already think that there's going to be more than one explanation for what it actually means. So we're going to follow a trail and we're going to see the various meanings of remoteness and remote in geography. So a simple explanation is geographic remoteness measures a physical location's level of access to goods and services. So we have a point in space, and it could be a small village and a small population, and it would be remote, and around it is basically the goods and services that it uses. We can move ourselves to a different scale of a large population center where we're expecting, with more people, we're probably going to have more goods and services that would be available compared to the smaller places. So we spend a lot of time in economic geography talking about big and small, more intense, less intense, extensive versus intensive, in terms of the range of goods and services in different size locations. As I mentioned, there are two conditions of remoteness: absolute, distance from, alone, and relative dimensions, compared with others. And by thinking about these two different definitions, we can shed light on the framing of the meaning of remoteness. Remoteness and remote places, a geographic perspective. Remoteness, the law interweaves with physical, legal, and imaginative remoteness, and it triggers a variety of geographic connections. We don't think about them like that, but that's in fact what happens. This reflects several topics and manifold geographic concerns, including territorial and maritime localization, so places adjacent to one another, being in an ocean as an island, being insular versus connected, and ontology, the impact of environmental crises on insular remoteness, places that are basically not just remote, but they are insular to themselves, and they are impacted by the ways in which we transform the world around us. And there's also the effect of colonial legacies on post-colonial insular imaginaries. Let me just give you an example. So for many people, they might not know that America is more than just the United States and its physical borders. We also have territories, and our territories are remote from the US, but from the land base of the US, but they are not entirely remote from us. And they aren't because we have legal and political relations with them, that because they are a territory of the United States, they are not completely remote. In other words, remote in that instance is best used cognizant of its powerful relative character. Remote. Remote in general, and insular remote in particular, represents a complex idea placed at the core of geographic interest. In geographic research, the topic is well charted and widely explored. The descriptor is linked, for example, to the concept of continentality, which describes how the climate of a place is affected by its remoteness from the oceans. So if you're a geographer, of course, you know what a continental climate is versus a Mediterranean climate. Well, these are all, in both cases, these are about proximity, but they can, in fact, have remote locations. So if you look in the Mediterranean Sea, you can see all of these little geographic nubs sitting in the ocean, and they are both related to one another, but they're also distinct. Depending on the distance to a coastline and on its connectivity, islands or archipelagos may be remote in several respects, by being at an edge, being far, being ill-connected, or by a combination of those. So we can think of remote as being this really kind of descriptive but elusive term that we use in lots of different circumstances to describe states of being. So what do we mean when we say remote? Well, for a lot of people in today's world, remote is a device that enables the operation of a separate electronic device without touching its components. It's a noun. Alone. Remoteness can describe the feeling in a person. I feel remote. I'm remote from other people. And I can be remote emotionally, and I can also be remote physically. Remote, non-proximate. I am not next to something or somewhere. I am remote, distance from something, somewhere. I'm away from population. Remote sensing is a really interesting part of geography that refers to imaging of the Earth's surface from satellites, or earlier than that, airplanes, to understand the Earth's geography. And it's also a technology. And so we have at once a kind of way of existing, and at the same time, we have a tool that we use to understand the world. Finally, geographic insularity is the case of non-contiguity. There's my remote. Here are some of the remote but linked landscapes that the United States has a political relationship to, but we're surely distant from. Here's an example of remote and proximity. Here we see this glorious, beautiful landscape, probably worth millions and millions of dollars. And the hill is occupied by this opulent structure. It is both close and remote. So it's remote from the folks in the village, but it's proximate to an urban area. I live in a place called Cohasset. It is a little town that is at the shore, and it is remote from Boston, but it is within the metropolitan area of Boston. So I am both remote and I'm proximate, distant, near. Here's an example of how we do work today. Here we have a man working on a piece of factory equipment. He is directing, it's actually an overhead rail that he's directing in a steel mill, and he's using various devices to pick up materials that he can't carry himself and move it to other places in the warehouse. This is an example. He's working remotely, but he's also having proximity with something that is remote. Here's the epitome of proximity and remoteness. So these are robots that are providing very precise materials on certain places within the bodies of automobiles, and it is clearly remote. You can't see a single human being in here, and yet there is somebody who is proximate to each one of these, because if they stop working, somebody has to go in and fix them. Here's the epitome of what we are doing today. This is what we can say remote work looks like. A workforce is today distributed away from office locations, and employees are wherever they feel most productive. Remote work was happening actually pre-COVID, but not at the scale of half of the American workforce. The pandemic accelerated it. The only question is how companies efficiently transition to an environment where workers have greater flexibility. And that is really what the future of technology is going to be all about. The big debate today, I'm in Boston and we are a place where we build all these technologies. The big question today is whether we'll go back to work in all the buildings in the American cities that are currently empty, or will we be able to change their use? We know we can change some of their uses, but we don't think we can actually change all of them. So we have a lot of uncertainty in the medium term as to where we will find work of the future. And this is everybody's wish, right? Looking out at the ocean, drinking a cup of tea, working on their computer, getting their 8 hours in. And there is people who are doing exactly this, but it is not the pervasive form. Most people went home during COVID. One of the most interesting things that happened during COVID was that people didn't just leave their offices. They left their houses and they moved to places all over the country. And we basically spawned a rural migration trend, which had been stagnant for about 2.5 decades. And the big question is what to make of it, why it's happening, and where it's heading. This is a table that talks about the net domestic migration by county population size, 2019 before COVID, 21 at the height of COVID, and 22 proximate to us today. And what we see is that if you look at the table and you see 2019, places that were experiencing migration began as places that were small and eventually became places that were large. And eventually we see that the majority of the movement goes from across the population size spectrum over to 2022, where the only migration that we're seeing now is migration moving from large cities. That large city migration process was happening prior to COVID and then accelerated. So here's a bar graph that gives you the same information and maybe a little bit more intelligible. The interesting point here is that not every place lost population or saw population change during COVID. We see here that the East South Central division across 2021, it did not experience continued population growth. So did the Mountain division. But if we move across back to the left corner, we see New England lost population from its largest cities. So did the Middle Atlantic. These are the traditional industrial regions of the country, but the Pacific region also lost population in the larger cities. And the reason is because in those specific places, the bigger cities are becoming increasingly uneconomic. They are not affordable for most people. So if people could move out to lower cost locations, they were either could and did, or they were forced out because of the cost of living. So it wasn't just COVID, it was also the fact that it's expensive to live in big cities. So has the meaning of remote changed based on this last 5-year period? There's more attention, and remote living saw an uptick. Big North, New England and Midwestern cities saw a slight decline. Mountain states certainly made out the best, and then low income and congested areas experienced modest declines. The interesting issue, though, is mountain states were already showing this particular set of processes. And the low income and congested areas also were showing the same kind of process. People were moving if they could financially move. So what we can say is probably this process of change in rural areas was a momentary process, and that the change in remote is one that is still yet to be determined. Thank you.